Make sure you're subscribed to Issues Etc. Type Issues Etc. in your podcast provider, hit that subscribe button, and leave us a 5-star review. This will make it easier for other podcast listeners to find Issues Etc.
Pro-life incumbents have done very well since Dobbs. Not one pro-life incumbent has lost a statewide race.
Margaret Thatcher very famously said, socialism works great until you run out of other people's money. In the Islamic system, the system works great until you run out of the infidels' money.
I love this quotation from Luther. He says, "Spare me from a church in which there are no sinners." The essential character of being a Christian is to be a redeemed sinner.
If we are Christians and we suffer, is that so unbelievable that we should bear a splinter of Jesus' cross after he has gone through so much as a perfect one?
Hospice nurses driving around from patient to patient love listening to Issues Etc.
Well, as the horrifying truth about China's forced organ harvesting industry continues to unfold and reveal new things, it goes from bad to worse to, well, some would say almost unbelievable. Greetings and welcome to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for tuning us in live on this Thursday afternoon, the 2nd of July. We're going to be concluding our two-part series on China's forced organ harvesting industry with Jan Jekielek. We'll spend some time with Dr. Michael New. A federal court appeals case on the legality of telehealth abortions will be our subject. And then we'll talk campus ministry with Pastor Michael Schurman of University Lutheran Chapel in Champaign, Illinois. We'll conclude everything today with part 2 of our series on divorce and remarriage with Dr. Ben Mays. Earlier this week, we began a conversation with Jan Jekielek. He's senior editor of the Epoch Times and author of the new book, Killed to Order. We talked about the ideological roots of the forced organ harvesting industry in the Chinese Communist Party. Let's pick up where we left off with his answer to my question, what he can tell us about the systemic involvement of Chinese physicians, hospitals, and the transplant infrastructure.
Well, this is a great question. And maybe I can start like this. As I described in an ethical system, right, it's actually a very complicated system because it relies, aside from kidney transplants where you can get one from a relative, for example, or someone else who's donating one, with these vital organs, it has to be a catastrophic accident. You're relying on chance, basically. You're relying on people not wearing their seatbelts. You're relying on people not wearing their helmets on a motorcycle and so forth. When you have a kill-to-order system, again, you have to remember, how is it possible to even have a system like this? Well, you need to have a dehumanized population. You need to have a population of people that the surgeons and their teams, which are quite sizable, are going to not have as big of a problem killing. And the system, by the way, also is designed to make you complicit. Like the few surgeons that we have that have told us about having killed people to order, there's not many, there's 2 that come to my mind right now. They all describe situations where initially they were kind of forced into it. They're like, under the cover of darkness, they get taken to a secret operation and the boss is there and they say, start cutting, and they realize that the person's still alive, but they do it. And, later, this one guy kind of comes clean many years later, right? Because they have to live with that. They had to live with that the fact that they did that, kind of to save themselves, of course, in the process, because there were armed guards around. I'm just giving an example of how they make people complicit and have to participate. But, basically, you've taken the entire transplantation industry by building this kill-to-order system, and you've essentially made them into murderers. It's unfathomable because, as I mentioned before, if you have this kill-to-order system, if you have this organ bank of people that you can use, and by the way, they worked on Falun Gong for 14 or 15 years. There's this mass growth of the organ transplant industry as they incarcerate the Falun Gong in the early years. It keeps growing. But then in 2014 and 2015, they add the Uyghur Muslims. In the northwest of China, there's a ethnic and religious minority that the regime was targeting. They incarcerated 1 million, dehumanized them, incarcerated 1 million of them. And then they built that whole region into a police state of sorts, hard to get in and out. And they started blood typing people in their homes. okay, blood typing and tissue typing. So you have a significant portion of the entire Uyghur population in the Northwest basically ready to be killed to order because they've been blood typed and tissue typed. So it's a situation where the most monstrous violation, killing people for organs, has become the standard way in which organ transplantation is done. There might be exceptions to that. Of course, I don't have access to that. It's all, in the realm of state secret. And the level of that the health profession has been compromised to is obviously, foundational, because there's a significant number of people, whether it's nurses or technicians or others, that are also part of the system that have also been compromised. And that doesn't just stay within the transplant professions. It kind of affects everybody involved.
Other than time and resources, what's stopping the Chinese government from blood typing and tissue typing their entire population for this purpose?
I think people might have issues with that. I mean, I'm sorry for being glib here, right? So part of what allows them, for example, do what they've done in Xinjiang is that they've been promoting this Han supremacism. The majority population in China is Han ethnicity. There's something like 100 other various minorities and so forth. But part of their tool of control of the society is to push this Han nationalism, Han supremacism. Remember, a regime only has control so far as people give it that control. Okay, so an example of this, to kind of frame that for you a little bit, back in 1989, during the Solidarity movement, just before the Berlin Wall fell, there was this moment, of course, the Solidarity had come on the scene, and there were some number of people involved in it, but there was this 2-week period, I forget exactly the timing, in 89, where, not in 89, this was in the mid-80s, where the number of people involved in Solidarity grew massively. And it wasn't clear exactly what it was that precipitated. There were a few different things, right? But the moment when this Solidarity trade union grew into several million, it was actually that everybody understood that the regime was done, because that was an expression of the fact that the people had decided, you know what, you're not going to be in charge anymore. And it was just a matter of figuring out, is it going to be more people that die or less people that die? Because of course they did kill a bunch of people, that they could have killed more. In the end, they decided to have these round table discussions and sort of transition. Most of the communists kind of refashioned themselves as liberal Democrats, sold state enterprises to themselves for large amounts of money. And some of them, and their kids are, still in power today. But there was this moment where, it became clear that society decided, you know what, you're not in charge anymore. And, and you can't kill the entire population to maintain your power, because what are you going to have power over? So it's something like that. It certainly is an urban myth in China, so to speak. Remember, most people in China don't have access to this system. It's only the super elites. But people in prisons and labor camps and re-education camps, they'll tell their prisoners, be good or we'll forced organ harvest you. That's something that's used. So some people know it's real. Some people view it as this kind of urban myth type thing, where it might be real. The regime is capable of it, but you've never encountered it personally in any way. And if you really understood that you're a likely organ donor for a Chinese leader, I think that might push a lot of people over the edge. There's a huge movement in China. It's called the Quit the Communist Party movement. What the activists do is they get people to quit either the Young Pioneers or the Youth League or the Communist Party. These are almost everybody in China has been part of one of these groups. They're basically kind of communist brainwashing structures, if you will. And the movement is to quietly basically say no to these things, and your name goes in this encrypted database. There's a whole system which they have. The point is, there's an active interest among Chinese to be done with the Communist Party. At the same time, they hold an unusual amount of power, or sort of unruly amount of power, and they are, deeply committed to exercising it in extreme ways against people that stand up against it. But I think that if the majority understood that they're susceptible to being organ donors as well, that might tip things over the edge, like what happened in Poland in the mid-'80s.
How has the West been complicit in these crimes?
It's really sad how the West has been complicit in these crimes. As an example, the most obvious way is we've trained some of these surgeons in our hospitals. Over 100 of them, we know, at least. We provide funding to some of these hospitals. There's partnerships between these hospitals. There's other training relationships. We provide some of the various materials and solutions that are used in the transplantation in China, which, as I have said, is basically all forced organ harvest, killed to order forced organ harvesting. We even provide technologies like ECMO, which we use to replace the heart and lungs for when catastrophic accident type surgeries need to be done and you need to keep someone alive while their heart and lungs are worked on. In China, these things were bought en masse into transplant hospitals when portable versions started coming out to be used as perfusion machines, basically keep a body warm longer so you can extract more organs out of it. So, I mean, that's just a handful of ways. But another way is many international organizations have not taken a position on this and said, hey, look, we can't work with you because you kill people to order. There is one major organization that has done that. That's the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation. They accept no papers from Communist China because their official position is they recognize that there's this huge ethical problem. I would like to see more organizations do that. Otherwise, you're playing this kind of complicity game because perhaps you like the Chinese research money. I don't know the reason entirely. Maybe it's also habit. I mean, I would argue that one of the major organizations, they tried to facilitate change, but this is one of the ways they make you complicit. They tried initially, and then the regime said, yeah, look at all the changes we made. And the changes were false or performative. But now the organization has sort of publicly been saying there's been all these changes. No one likes to admit they're wrong or go back on such things. So now you're kind of stuck, and now you're complicit because you're basically validating a falsehood, allowing this to keep going, but perhaps too afraid to admit that you've been had. And that's an example that is so common, right? Even among US corporations, there's all these corporations that have just generally invested massive amounts of money into communist China, but they can never get it out because the regime controls that. Like just because you invested $1 billion doesn't mean you can cash that check, right? And so many of these companies don't want to admit that they can't cash that check, so they just keep that money. Officially looks like they still have it, but in reality, it's purely at the discretion of the regime. And there's been so many examples of the regime just simply seizing, with assets or funds and so forth at its whim.
How does this forced organ harvesting fit into the Chinese Communist Party's broader strategy against the West and its own population?
When you deal with any communist regime, and the Chinese one is just the largest and most powerful now, and thereby the most able to affect what I'm about to say, the forced organ harvesting gives you an insight into the mentality, how they instrumentalize everything, including human bodies, how they view their own people, and of course, by extension, us, with this very cold, empty, materialist calculus. Okay. I think one of the big mistakes, if you will, or just willful blindness, perhaps, is our inability to understand this, that we're not dealing with just another government, with another, like a normal government. Or it's sort of it views us through the eyes of perhaps like a psychopath might view another person, right? There isn't that conscience that is there to guide things. And see, I'm not an isolationist, by the way. I don't believe in that at all. On the other hand, you have to be, if you're not clear on who you're dealing with when you interact, you're going to get had. And so I think, this is a very powerful window, if you will, to understand that the regime, because of its nature is like this, it views any free society as a threat. As I mentioned, the number one goal is the survival and supremacy of the Communist Party. Every free society is a threat to that because it shows how people can be. And there's some portion of people in every society which yearn for that freedom. The society is also parasitic, much as it's parasitic on the organs, on the bodies of its class enemies. It's also parasitic on the technologies and the education systems and so forth of free countries. So I think that this forced organ harvesting is just a very powerful window into understanding how the regime views or instrumentalizes its relationships with the West, as well as, of course, with its own subjects and so forth, but also with the West and frankly every country. And it helps us understand that, unfortunately, it's not content to basically staying in its own area, so to speak, staying in its own lane. This is part of the reason, for example, that it has such a particular obsession with Taiwan, because Taiwan is an example of, a very similar group of people to the composition of the mainland, living free and being inordinately successful, i.e., something that a lot of people don't know is that Taiwan has a 3 times GDP per capita of the mainland China as a free society. It's sort of a finger in the eyes, the thing of the regime, showing, free people do a lot better if they're given the opportunity.
Jan Jekielek is our guest, author of the new book, Killed to Order. We're talking about China's forced organ harvesting industry. We'll discuss the Kissinger Doctrine next.
Criticism.
Thank God that it's 5:01 and the show is over.
Commendation.
I am not a Lutheran, but I regularly listen to Issues, etc., and thank you for putting this on the air.
Conundrum.
A Catholic friend has come to our LCMS church, and he said, "Why do you say very God, a very God?" And I couldn't think of a good answer.
The Issues, etc. comment line, 618-223-8382.
This fallen creation is bested by tornado, hurricane, flood, pandemic, and more. LCMS Disaster Response helps our congregations, their pastors, and other church workers to reach out to their members and neighbors with mercy which flows from Christ to altar. We offer quality volunteer training, help for congregational readiness and response, and disaster grant funding. To learn more, visit lcms.org/disaster. That's lcms.org/disaster.
Others talk. We have something to say. You're listening to Issues, etc.
If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free.
Dr. Russell Dawn, president of Concordia University, Chicago.
Indeed, the quest for truth is at the core of a university's purpose. The liberal arts, illuminated by the revealed truths of Scripture, are powerful for equipping students for a life of self-governance. A disciple is one who follows the Master. So what does it mean to follow Jesus? He said that it means to take up one's cross. The cross is thus the symbol of dying for others, of dying to self for the sake of serving others. And a life of service is a life well lived.
Truth, freedom, vocation. Concordia University, Chicago. cuchicago.edu.
We're concluding our 2-part series on China's forced organ harvesting industry. Jan Jekielek is our guest, senior editor of the Epoch Times. Jan, what is the Kissinger Doctrine and why are you critical of it?
So something that was dubbed the Kissinger Doctrine, I kind of use this a bit broadly, this term a bit broadly, but the Kissinger Doctrine is the idea that if we pump enough cash into communist China, we're going to liberalize them. they're going to become a Taiwan or a South Korea or Japan or something like that. And this was a sham idea from the very beginning, and I'll explain why we knew that. But this Kissinger doctrine was so powerful, especially, I remember this because back in the year 2000, as I started working on China human rights related issues, I mean, this was something that almost everybody believed. It wasn't a left-right thing. It was like 95% thing of people kind of believed this. And part of it was because, of course, this is what Communist China was pushing, but also very powerful, very influential US politicians were pushing it. I mean, I've even talked with a former US senator who told me, I completely believe that. And this is a person who, obviously has changed their mind quite a bit. But it was like, yeah, no, I was totally on board for that. Everybody believed that. And so now here's why we knew at Epoch Times, even as far back as 2000, that this was a sham. And the reason is that the Chinese Communist Party was literally killing people for exercising the equivalent of what we would call our First Amendment rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom to assemble, basically be together with others you care about. These publicly, these things are the core, freedom of conscience, right? The core of basic human rights, these inalienable rights. And the Chinese Communist Party was killing people for exercising these rights. There's no way that's a liberalizing society. That's an extreme scenario. And I think we did help shift that narrative to one closer to reality, because we were trying to, from the very beginning, we were explaining to people, look what they're doing. This is not a liberalizing regime, right? And the other piece to this, which is very important, is that it's a totalitarian regime and not a mere authoritarian one. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is that totalitarian regimes destroy or subvert what we call civil society. So this is, what de Tocqueville saw in America back in the day as being the thing that would, prophetically, he saw this as making America incredibly successful, would be basically Americans self-organizing around issues that are important, creating institutions around issues that are important, not by government edict, but simply because they had a common interest in doing that, right? Those structures, those types of institutions, that's precisely what, there's a whole department in the Chinese Communist Party, or a ministry if you're Canadian, or in that type of system of liberal democracy, one of the most funded, that's exclusively committed to subverting or destroying civil society, both within China and outside of China, in communities where Chinese operate. So basically, if you can't control it, the idea is that the government must control every aspect of society. There's no self-organization. Now, self-organization is okay as long as the CCP's people are in there guiding it, right? That's the subversion part I'm talking about. Or if that's impossible, they break it, they destroy it. And I actually think this is one of the reasons why the regime became so obsessed with destroying Falun Gong practitioners, because they had no way, because of this unusual, decentralized, and very, very self-directive structure, they had no way of doing either subverting or destroying them, because it didn't. This institution didn't really exist as an institution. It's just sort of individual people with a common direction, common frame of mind.
How has the Chinese Communist Party used international institutions and Western self-interest to shield these crimes?
In a whole lot of ways. This is the subject of a whole long discussion. But just as an example, okay, have you ever heard of Confucius Institutes?
Yes.
So the Chinese Communist Party would basically create partnerships with American universities and colleges and high schools, hundreds of them, and fund Chinese language and culture learning. The problem is this was Chinese language and culture learning with, they say Chinese characteristics, but that's communist characteristics. In other words, according to the politics which we find acceptable. And so many of these schools took them up on this. And this was a way also to create, because remember, like, of course, who's going to reject funding, right, for an institution? The problem is that it always comes with strings attached. This is just one example I'm giving you, right? Another example, that's a big example, because that shifted a lot of universities. Even today, there's a lot of universities that through this began with some of these Confucius institutes. It also began with just accepting a lot of Chinese international students who pay huge amounts to be in those schools. So now there's a financial incentive. And it's very hard to, if you start, for example, having on the human rights side to be like a Falun Gong event related to exposing human rights violations against Falun Gong or Tibetans or Uyghurs, then the school gets a call and says, hey, listen, you guys, what are you doing? Like, don't you want to have more these students come back? If you keep up with this, you may not get those really lucrative international students back. And unfortunately, a lot of schools would back down in that sort of a situation. You know, at the corporate level, you can just imagine how this would work. Once there's these very deep financial relationships which would form. And it's fascinating because the Kissinger Doctrine facilitated this rush into China, where everyone believed that they have to get their money into China. Otherwise, they're going to miss out on this massive Chinese market, which is just on the verge of developing. Never did. A whole bunch of reasons for that we could discuss. But the moment that you set up these strong financial relationships where you're making 10, 20% on facilitating investment into China, it's very hard. And now you've committed a lot of funds as the company. As part of the partnership, you have to transfer all your IP over. There's so much sunk cost, and there's so much sort of lucrative benefit in, sort of service fees or whatever. It's very hard to even notice that things are happening that might make you need to rethink that relationship. These are just a couple of examples of, how the Chinese regime has made us complicit. I have a whole chapter in Kill to Order. By the way, that's killtoorder.com. Again, if you're interested in reading the book, I would strongly recommend it. But I have a whole chapter committed to explaining all the different ways that the regime makes both its own people and also us in the West and free countries complicit in its activities and crimes.
Tell us about the Block Organ Transplant Purchases from China Act.
So this is an act that is still in committee, as I understand it. I mean, I haven't checked in the last few days, but there's about 6 states now that have passed laws that basically say that Medicare, Medicaid insurance can't pay for transplants in China. And this is kind of the federal version of that for targeting federal Medicare, Medicaid. And so this is good. I think any legislation that will reduce the amount of people that would go to China to get a transplant is incredibly valuable.
Has there been any action or reaction from the international community to China's forced organ harvesting?
Sadly, it's been a lot more muted than one would like. There's 8 countries that have passed laws that in some way limit this. Actually, I was just in Taiwan recently. I testified in front of their legislature, and part of the testimonies was about a Chinese doctor, who was facilitating organ transplantation in China for Taiwanese. And that person was found guilty. I don't think they're in prison, but they got prison time. Perhaps I think there's some sort of bail nuance or something, but he has been stripped of his license. I'm not aware of many instances like this. This might be a first. I'm looking into this case quite a bit more, but so that is an actual reaction. There's been, as I mentioned, 8 countries that have passed laws. Israel was one of the first because of the whistleblower that I mentioned to you before. There's been international organizations that have slowly come on board, like the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation, but too few others. A number of amazing, what you would call nonprofits or NGOs that work on this. Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, Torsten Trey runs that, an amazing group. They've been doing some of the advocacy around some of the legislation here, as I understand it. I mean, in the US, there's this ETAC coalition, but again, a second group that has done kind of remarkable work. Actually, this is very exciting for me. Rotary International, like Rotary Club, they have in the last few years, they've built a satellite club, meaning it's not located in any one particular jurisdiction, that's committed exclusively to ending forced organ harvesting. And so that's an exciting development. They're doing a lot of awareness raising through films. They've actually gotten Killed to Order as an educational material that they're using now. And I've actually they convinced me to join Rotary and help with this. I'm very much doing that now. So I'm seeing more and more of a reaction, but it's a little bit late coming. And I hope that we can get some significant legislation passed. Actually, in the Senate right now, I'm conflating two bills. There's actually two bills, okay? One is a bill that passed the House, H 1503. That's the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act by Chris Smith. But the one that I'm mentioning now, it's called the Falun Gong and Victims of Forced Organ Harvesting Protection Act. That's S4009. That's actually advanced in the Senate and hopefully to a floor vote sometime in the near future.
Jan Jekielek is senior editor of the Epoch Times and is author of the new book, Killed to Order. You'll find a link to this book on the podcast page for this episode at issuesetc.org. Jan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Michael New of the Charlotte Lozier Institute is with us on the other side of the break. We'll get an update on a telehealth abortion case that is in the federal appeals court.
This is Molly Hemingway, encouraging you to listen to my favorite podcast, Issues, Etc. Every day you get in-depth interviews with host Todd Wilkin asking expert guests substantive, thought-provoking questions on all of the important news and issues of our day. The expert guests are in culture, law, ethics, philosophy, theology, and apologetics. Expert guests, expansive topics, always extolling Christ. Issues, Etc.
The church's music from the 20th century. The 17th century. The 11th century. The 8th century. The 4th century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
A podcast for thinking Christians. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
This is Jeff Schwartz, General Manager of Lutheran Public Radio, with a message for listeners in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. We pledge to have Issues, Etc. podcasts posted daily, no later than 5 p.m. Mountain, 4 p.m. Pacific. This will allow you to download and listen to the latest Issues, Etc. podcast weekdays during your evening commute. Again, if you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zone, download Issues, Etc. before you leave work and listen during your drive home.